I never thought my life would unravel like this, until the night my son whispered, "Mom, we can't keep hiding this anymore." His eyes, intense and unrelenting, locked with mine, stirring something I couldn't explain but couldn't deny. My husband's suitcase sat by the door, a silent reminder that he could return at any moment. The line between right and wrong blurred, and I knew nothing would ever be the same again. We were a family built on routine and what I thought was stability. My husband, Richard, was a successful businessman, always on the move, providing for us but rarely present. His charm was undeniable, and in our early years, I'd been swept away by his ambition and unwavering confidence. But over time, the love we shared had faded into a hollow partnership, a shadow of what we once had. Our son, Jake, was my pride and joy. As a child, he was gentle and kind, always eager to please. But as he grew, the softness in his demeanor was replaced by a quiet intensity. He'd taken on responsibilities far beyond his years, becoming the emotional glue holding our household together as Richard became more distant. Our home was a picture of perfection to anyone looking in. Friends would marvel at our seemingly perfect life, a spacious house in the suburbs, summer vacations in Europe, and a calendar packed with social events. But behind closed doors, we were strangers drifting further apart. Richard and I rarely spoke unless it was about bills, schedules, or polite pleasantries exchanged at dinner. Jake had always been my comfort, the one person who saw me when no one else did. He'd become my confidant in a way I knew was unconventional, but I justified it as the result of Richard's emotional absence. His gaze often lingered too long, his questions probing too deep. I chalked it up to him being protective of me, his mother, who had sacrificed her career and aspirations to support his father's dreams. One evening, as I stood by the kitchen window watching the sunset, I felt Jake's presence behind me. His shadow stretched across the room, and for the first time, I felt a tension I couldn't name. It wasn't maternal or familiar. It was something far more complicated. His voice, low and deliberate, startled me from my thoughts. "Mom, are you happy?" he asked, his tone laden with unspoken weight. The question lingered in the air, echoing louder than the silence in my marriage. I turned to face him, and for a moment, his eyes felt like they saw through every mask I wore. I didn't know then, but that moment marked the beginning of the unraveling of everything I thought I knew. The cracks in my world began as whispers, small, unspoken things that slowly grew louder until I could no longer ignore them. It started with Jake's subtle shifts in behavior. His questions about my happiness became more frequent, his tone carrying a depth that felt too mature for his years. At first, I dismissed it as the sensitivity of a young man trying to protect his mother. But there was something else, something I couldn't quite place. Richard, on the other hand, became a phantom in our lives. His business trips grew longer, his phone calls shorter, and his once flattering attention was now reserved for his work colleagues and clients. The physical distance between us mirrored the emotional chasm that had formed. I couldn't remember the last time we shared a genuine moment, and the house began to feel like a place of isolation, not refuge. One evening, as I folded laundry in the living room, I noticed Jake lingering by the doorway. His eyes, usually filled with warmth, carried a weight that made my heart skip a beat. "You look tired, Mom," he said softly, stepping closer. His words were simple, but the way he said them made my chest tighten. I offered a weak smile, brushing his concern aside, but I couldn't ignore the way he studied me, as if searching for something I didn't even realize I was hiding. The moments between us grew heavier. He'd stand too close, his hand brushing against mine for just a second too long. His compliments, once innocently reassuring, began to feel loaded. "You look beautiful today," he said one morning as I stood in the kitchen, still in my robe. My cheeks flushed, and I quickly busied myself with the dishes, pretending not to notice. I started to question myself. Was I imagining it? Reading too much into his words, his actions? But then there were the glances, quick, fleeting, but unmistakable. The way his eyes followed me as I moved through the house, how he lingered when he thought I wasn't looking. It left me unsettled, yet strangely alive, as if I'd been asleep for years and was finally waking up. The tension only deepened when Richard returned home briefly between trips. At dinner, Jake's demeanor shifted entirely. He was polite but distant, his usual charm replaced by a cold reserve. When Richard asked about school, Jake's answers were clipped, his tone almost defiant. "Everything's fine," he said flatly, not meeting his father's eyes. The room was thick with unspoken words, the air practically vibrating with unease. Later that night, as I lay in bed, I couldn't shake the feeling that everything in my life was teetering on the edge. I heard the faint creak of the floorboards outside my room and held my breath, waiting. The door didn't open, but the shadow beneath it lingered for a moment before retreating. I exhaled, my pulse racing, unsure if I felt relief or disappointment. The following week, Richard announced yet another business trip, leaving me and Jake alone in the house. The relief I felt at his departure was immediate but laced with guilt. Jake, however, seemed almost emboldened. He started spending more time around me, his presence a constant reminder of the growing tension between us. One afternoon, as I worked in the garden, I felt his gaze on me from the window. When I looked up, he didn't turn away. Instead, he stepped outside and walked toward me, his expression unreadable. "Do you ever think about leaving this life, Mom?" he asked, his voice low but steady. The question caught me off guard, and I stared at him, unable to find the words. He stepped closer, and I could feel the warmth of his presence, the intensity of his gaze pulling me in. "You deserve more than this," he said softly, and for a moment, I believed him. That was the moment I knew. Whatever was happening between us was no longer something I could ignore. The days after Richard's departure were filled with an energy I couldn't define, a dangerous undercurrent that seemed to pull Jake and me closer together. The boundaries that had always existed, clear, unbreakable, began to blur. I told myself it was harmless, that I was overthinking. But deep down, I knew better. Every glance, every fleeting touch carried a weight I couldn't ignore. One evening, I stood in the kitchen preparing dinner. The sun had dipped below the horizon, casting a soft orange glow across the room. Jake walked in silently, his footsteps almost inaudible. I didn't hear him approach until he was right behind me. When I turned, I nearly bumped into him, startled by how close he was. "You scared me," I said, laughing nervously. But Jake didn't move. His eyes locked on mine, and the intensity in them made my breath hitch. "Sorry," he murmured, his voice low, almost a whisper. He reached out, his fingers brushing against mine as he handed me the knife I'd set down. The contact was brief, but it sent a shiver through me. I pulled my hand away, my pulse quickening. "You shouldn't sneak up on me like that," I said, trying to inject some lightness into the moment. But the air between us was anything but light. Jake leaned against the counter, watching me as I worked. His gaze was heavy, and I could feel it on me, tracing every movement. "You don't have to do this, you know," he said suddenly. I stopped chopping, glancing at him. "Do what?" I asked, though I wasn't sure I wanted to hear the answer. "Pretend like everything's fine," he said. "Like you're happy." I froze, his words cutting deeper than I expected. "Jake, I trailed off, unsure how to respond. He stepped closer, his presence overwhelming. "You deserve to be happy, Mom," he said, his voice soft but firm. I looked away, unable to meet his gaze. "It's not that simple," I said, my voice trembling. But it could be, he replied. His hand brushed against mine again, and this time, I didn't pull away. For a moment, we stood there, the unspoken tension between us growing heavier with every passing second. I could feel the warmth of his body, the steady rhythm of his breath. I wanted to step back, to put distance between us, but I couldn't move. The sound of a timer going off broke the spell, and I turned away quickly, focusing on the task at hand. But the moment lingered in my mind long after it passed. That night, I lay awake, staring at the ceiling, replaying the look in Jake's eyes, the way his voice had trembled with emotion. I told myself it was just concern, a son worried about his mother. But a part of me knew it was more than that. The next morning, Jake and I sat across from each other at the breakfast table. The silence was heavy, filled with words neither of us dared to say. I was thinking we could spend the day together, he said suddenly, breaking the tension. Just the two of us. I hesitated, the suggestion catching me off guard. I don't know, Jake. I started, but he interrupted me. Please, he said, his voice softer now. It's been a long time since we've done something together. Against my better judgment, I agreed. We drove to a nearby hiking trail, the crisp morning air doing little to dispel the unease I felt. As we walked, Jake stayed close, his hand occasionally brushing against mine. Each time I told myself it was accidental, but the deliberate way he moved made me question my own judgment. At one point, we stopped at a scenic overlook, the valley below stretching out in a patchwork of greens and browns. I leaned against the railing, trying to calm the whirlwind of emotions inside me. Jake stood beside me, his shoulder grazing mine. Do you ever feel like you're trapped? He asked, his voice barely above a whisper. His words hit me like a punch to the gut. I turned to him, and for the first time, I couldn't hide the truth. Yes, I admitted, my voice cracking. He looked at me, his expression unreadable. Then why don't you do something about it? He asked. I didn't have an answer. Instead, I looked away, tears pricking at the corners of my eyes. Jake reached out, his hand resting lightly on my shoulder. You're not alone, he said softly. You don't have to go through this by yourself. His words were meant to comfort me, but they only added to the confusion swirling inside me. I stepped away, needing space to think, to breathe. But even as I walked ahead, putting distance between us, I could feel his presence, steady and unyielding, following me. By the time we returned home, the lines between us had blurred even further. I told myself I could fix it, that I could put things back to the way they were. But deep down, I knew it was already too late. The days that followed were a blur of tension and stolen glances. I tried to maintain a facade of normalcy, to convince myself that whatever was happening between Jake and me was nothing more than a misunderstanding, a phase, perhaps. But the reality of our situation was becoming impossible to ignore. Every time he looked at me, spoke to me, or brushed past me, my resolve weakened. The boundaries I'd clung to so desperately were eroding faster than I could rebuild them. It was a quiet evening when everything came crashing down. Richard was still away on his business trip, leaving Jake and me alone in the house. I sat in the living room, a book open on my lap, though I hadn't read a single word. The silence between us felt like a living thing, growing heavier with each passing second. Jake entered the room, his presence commanding my attention even though he said nothing at first. He sat down on the couch across from me, his gaze unwavering. "Mom?" he said finally, breaking the silence. His voice was calm, but there was an edge to it that made my heart race. "We need to talk." I closed the book, my hands trembling slightly. "Jake, I don't think—" I started, but he cut me off. "No more pretending," he said firmly. "You know what's been happening between us. You feel it just as much as I do." His words hung in the air, a declaration I couldn't bring myself to deny. My heart pounded as I stared at him, my mind racing with thoughts I couldn't even begin to articulate. "This isn't right," I whispered, my voice barely audible. "You're my son." Jake leaned forward, his elbows resting on his knees as he fixed me with a piercing gaze. "I'm not a child anymore," he said softly. "And you're not just my mother. You're a person, a woman. And I see you, really see you." Tears filled my eyes as I shook my head, unable to comprehend how we'd reached this point. "Jake, stop," I pleaded. "We can't. This isn't—" Before I could finish, he was beside me, his hand resting lightly on my shoulder. "You don't have to say anything," he murmured. "But you don't have to hide how you feel either." I stood abruptly, putting distance between us. "This has to stop," I said, my voice trembling. "Whatever this is, it can't happen. Richard will be home any day now, and everything will go back to normal." But even as I said the words, I knew they weren't true. Nothing about our lives would ever be normal again. The tension came to a head the following night. I was in the kitchen cleaning up after dinner when I heard the soft creak of footsteps behind me. I turned to find Jake standing in the doorway, his expression unreadable. "I can't keep doing this," he said, his voice low but firm. "Doing what?" I asked, though I already knew the answer. "Pretending like there's nothing here," he said, stepping closer. "Like I don't feel what I feel. Like you don't feel it too." My breath caught as he closed the distance between us, his proximity overwhelming. "Jake, please," I whispered, tears streaming down my face. "This isn't right. It's not—" But before I could finish, the sound of the front door opening shattered the moment. Richard's voice called out from the hallway, cheerful and oblivious. "I'm home," he announced, his footsteps echoing through the house. Jake and I froze, the reality of the situation crashing down on us. I wiped my tears hastily, turning away from him as Richard entered the kitchen. He smiled as he set his suitcase down, his eyes flicking between us. "What's going on in here?" he asked, his tone light. "Nothing," I said quickly, forcing a smile. "Just cleaning up." Richard didn't seem to notice the tension, but Jake's expression was unreadable. He muttered something about heading to his room and disappeared upstairs, leaving me alone with my husband. As the evening wore on, I couldn't shake the feeling that everything was unraveling. Richard chatted about his trip, oblivious to the storm brewing beneath the surface. I nodded and smiled in all the right places, but my mind was elsewhere, replaying the events of the past few days. Later that night, as I lay in bed beside Richard, the weight of everything became too much to bear. My heart was heavy with guilt and confusion, and the lines between right and wrong felt impossibly blurred. I thought of Jake, of the way he looked at me, the way he made me feel seen and understood in a way I hadn't felt in years. And I thought of Richard, the man I'd built a life with, who was now little more than a stranger to me. The breaking point came the next morning. I was in the bathroom, splashing cold water on my face, when I heard a knock on the door. I opened it to find Jake standing there, his expression resolute. "We need to talk," he said. "Not now," I said, trying to close the door, but he held it open. "This can't wait," he insisted. "You know it can't." Before I could respond, Richard's voice called out from the bedroom. "Is everything okay?" Jake and I exchanged a tense glance, the weight of the moment pressing down on us. "Everything's fine," I called back, forcing a smile. But as I closed the bathroom door, I knew that nothing would ever be fine again. The morning after that tense moment in the bathroom, the house felt heavier than ever. Richard had left for work early, oblivious to the storm brewing beneath the surface. Jake was nowhere to be seen, and I found myself pacing the living room, my thoughts spiraling out of control. Every glance at the photos on the mantel, a family vacation, Jake's high school graduation, our wedding day, felt like a cruel reminder of the life I was on the brink of destroying. When Jake finally emerged from his room, his expression was guarded, his usual intensity replaced by a strange calm. He sat across from me at the dining table, his eyes searching mine. "We need to talk," he said again, his tone soft but unyielding. I wanted to protest, to avoid the conversation I knew was inevitable, but I was too exhausted to fight. "I can't do this, Jake," I said, my voice trembling. "I can't risk everything we've built, everything your father and I have worked for." Jake leaned forward, his hands clasped together. "And what about you, Mom?" he asked. "What about what you deserve? Are you really happy living like this, pretending everything is okay when it's not?" Tears filled my eyes as his words cut deep. "It doesn't matter what I feel," I said, my voice cracking. "I made a commitment to your father, to this family. I can't just throw that away." "But you're not happy," Jake pressed, his voice rising slightly. "You're just existing, going through the motions. I see it every day." The raw honesty in his words was almost too much to bear. I stood abruptly, turning away from him. "This has to stop, Jake," I said, my back to him. "Whatever this is, it can't go any further." Jake didn't respond immediately. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely a whisper. "I just want you to be happy," he said. "That's all I've ever wanted." The rest of the day passed in a haze of silence. Jake kept his distance, retreating to his room, while I threw myself into chores in a futile attempt to distract myself. By the time Richard returned home that evening, I was a wreck. I plastered on a smile and tried to act normal, but the cracks in my facade were painfully obvious. During dinner, the tension was palpable. Jake barely spoke, and Richard, though initially oblivious, began to notice. "Is everything okay?" he asked, looking between us. "Everything's fine," I said quickly, forcing a smile. But Jake's silence spoke volumes. That night, as Richard slept beside me, I lay awake, my mind racing. I couldn't keep living like this, caught between the life I'd built and the emotions I couldn't control. Something had to give. The breaking point came a few days later. Richard had left for another trip, and Jake and I were alone again. The house was eerily quiet, the tension between us like a living thing. As I sat in the living room, staring blankly at the television, Jake entered the room. His expression was resolute, his eyes filled with determination. "Mom, I can't do this anymore," he said, his voice firm. "I can't keep pretending like everything's fine when it's not." I looked up at him, my heart pounding. "Jake, we've talked about this," I said, my voice trembling. "We can't—" "I love you," he interrupted, his voice breaking. "Not just as a son, but as something more. And I know you feel it too." The words hung in the air, heavy and undeniable. Tears streamed down my face as I shook my head. "This isn't right," I whispered. "It's not supposed to be like this." Jake took a step closer, his eyes locked on mine. "I know it's complicated," he said. "I know it's not what either of us expected, but you can't deny what's happening between us." Before I could respond, the sound of a car pulling into the driveway shattered the moment. Richard was home early. Panic set in as I scrambled to compose myself. Jake stepped back, his expression unreadable, and disappeared into the hallway just as Richard walked through the door. He greeted me with a smile, completely unaware of the chaos unfolding beneath the surface. For the rest of the evening, I was a bundle of nerves, my mind racing with thoughts of what could have happened, what almost happened. As I lay in bed that night, staring at the ceiling, I realized that my life was spiraling out of control. The lines I thought were unbreakable had been crossed, and there was no going back. The fallout was inevitable. The tension between Jake and me became impossible to hide, and Richard, though initially oblivious, began to notice. One evening he confronted me, his tone tinged with suspicion. "Is there something going on between you and Jake?" he asked, his eyes searching mine. The question knocked the breath out of me. I stammered, trying to come up with an explanation, but the look in Richard's eyes told me he already knew. In the days that followed Richard's confrontation, the fragile foundation of our family crumbled entirely. His question lingered in the air, unanswered but damning, as if the silence itself confirmed his worst fears. I couldn't find the words to deny or explain what he suspected, and the distance between us grew into a chasm neither of us could bridge. Richard began spending more nights away, claiming work obligations, but I knew better. He couldn't bear to be near me. The guilt gnawed at my insides, a constant reminder of the choices I'd made and the lines I'd allowed to blur. Every moment alone with Jake felt like walking a razor's edge, each interaction charged with unspoken tension. I avoided him as much as I could, but the house was too small to escape entirely. Jake, for his part, seemed caught between remorse and defiance. He would watch me from across the room, his eyes filled with a mix of longing and regret. "I'm sorry," he said one evening, breaking the silence between us. "I never meant to hurt you." Tears welled in my eyes as I looked at him. "You didn't just hurt me, Jake," I said softly. "You've hurt all of us. Your father, yourself. This family will never be the same." He nodded, his expression heavy with shame. "I know," he said, "but I can't change how I feel. I wanted you to know that." The weight of his words was suffocating, and I found myself retreating to my bedroom, locking the door behind me as if it could keep the pain out. That night, as I stared at the ceiling, I realized the depth of the damage that had been done. The life I had built, imperfect as it was, had been irreparably shattered. In the weeks that followed, I made a decision. I couldn't stay in the house, surrounded by memories of everything that had gone wrong. I needed space, distance, a chance to rebuild what little remained of my sense of self. I packed my bags one morning while Richard was away and left a note on the kitchen counter. "I'm sorry," it read. "I need time to figure things out. Please take care of Jake." I didn't know where I was going, only that I couldn't stay. The road stretched out before me, a symbol of the unknown future I now faced. As I drove away from the house, tears streaming down my face, I thought about the choices that had led me here. I thought about the woman I used to be, the woman I had lost somewhere along the way. In the end, I knew there was no justification for what had happened. Love, desire, confusion, none of it could excuse the betrayal I had allowed to unfold. But if there was one thing I could take from the wreckage, it was this. I needed to rediscover who I was, independent of anyone else. I needed to face my own pain and heal, not for Richard, not for Jake, but for myself. Months passed, and slowly, I began to rebuild. Therapy became a lifeline, a way to untangle the web of guilt, shame, and longing that had consumed me. I reconnected with old friends, found solace in their support, and started to rediscover the parts of myself I had buried for so long. Jake stayed with Richard, and though our communication was sparse, I knew he was trying to move forward too. It would take years, perhaps a lifetime, for us to truly heal. But I held on to the hope that one day, we could find a way to exist in each other's lives without the weight of what had happened between us. Looking back, I realize now that the choices we make in moments of weakness can have consequences that ripple through every corner of our lives. The pain I caused, the trust I broke, those wounds may never fully heal. But I've learned that healing begins with accountability, with facing the truth no matter how ugly it may be. If I could offer one piece of advice to anyone reading this, it would be this. Love yourself enough to set boundaries, to walk away from what feels wrong, even if it's difficult. Because in the end, The cost of crossing those lines is far greater than you can ever imagine. If you were in her position, what would you have done? Could you have resisted the temptation or saved your family from falling apart? Share your thoughts in the comments below. I'd love to hear your perspective. Don't forget to like and subscribe for more gripping stories like this one. You won't believe the twists and turns in the next tale coming your way. Stay tuned.